The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. We're at the Harry T. and Harriette V. Moore Cultural Complex in Mims, Florida, just north of Titusville and Cape Canaveral and east of Orlando. On Christmas night 1951, a bomb exploded under the home of educator and activist Harry T. Moore. He and his wife both died from injuries sustained in the blast, making them the first martyrs of the contemporary civil rights movement.
Harry Moore grew up in a little place called Houston, outside of Live Oak, which is just really a hole in the wall. I mean, there's just nothing there, no stop sign, traffic light. His father died when he was young. His father worked on the railroads, taking care of the big water tanks for the steam engines. And his mother worked in the cotton fields, and then she had a little store, basically just a little shack where she sold candy and soda pops and goods like that.
His early life was kind of a normal boy growing up. His parents was interested in him having an education. Unfortunately, his father died, and his mother ran a small store trying to sustain the family. She decided the following year to let him go to Jacksonville and live with three of his aunts who were professional women. Two were nurses, and I believe one was a teacher. And so his teenage years involved being exposed to black businesses and black professionals in the Jacksonville area, and that seemed to have molded him into being a professional person himself. And of course, he went on and got what was called a normal degree and became a teacher. Later on became principal of the Titusville Negro School.
I think that was the other part, that he got out of the country and not just living with these three women who were talking politics and literature and world events, but the black community in Jacksonville was vibrant and alive with culture and black-owned businesses. So I really think it really just opened up the world to him.
Harry T. Moore left Jacksonville to become a teacher. He made his way to Brevard County in 1925 to teach at the Cocoa Colored School and was later promoted to principal of the Titusville Negro School.
One of the things about that I don't think many people realize is even as late as the 1930s, only half of the counties in Florida had a black high school. So if you wanted to go beyond elementary school to school, often you had to go out of town, you had to go away. So Harry left Jacksonville and actually went back to Live Oak and went to Florida Memorial College, which was located there. It was a college, but also had a high school program. So he graduated in 1925 with a normal degree, basically a teaching certificate, and got a job in Cocoa, teaching in Brevard County.
He came here in 1925 as a teacher. The following year, from what we read, he met his future wife at a bid whist card party. That was one of the things that he enjoyed, was playing cards, and she did also. They dated, courted for a year or so, and then he asked her to marry him.
Well, I think it's an interesting thing. They were both very sort of sober, serious people. They met at a card party, at a whist party, And she was an older woman. She was like 2 years older than he was. But obviously they hit it off. He used to tell his daughters it was love at first sight. And so very quickly they got married. And her parents sort of gave them a piece of land on their property in this grove, and they built a house and started a family.
About once a month, we did go to Orlando or Daytona, depending on where the Best Western was showing. And we would do our shopping. My mother made all of our clothes, and so we'd shop at Sears for material and that household items. And then after that, Orlando and Daytona both had very nice black restaurants. So we'd go and have dinner. And then we always ended up at the movies. And it was always a Western because that was my dad's favorite.
Education was important in the Moore household. The entire family, Harry, Harriette, Evangeline, and her older sister Peaches, would all graduate from Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona. Harry T. Moore's civil rights activities, including an effort to equalize pay for black and white teachers, would lead to him being forced to resign from the Brevard County school system.
I think he started his activism with what he knew best, which was education. And so through his involvement with the Florida State Teachers Association, which was the black teacher organization, he filed the first lawsuit in the Deep South to equalize black and white teacher salaries. Black teachers, black principals made basically half what their white counterparts did. That was also the first time that he interacted with Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall had filed the first lawsuit, had won the first lawsuit in the country to equalize black and white teacher salaries. But that was in Maryland, border state, and Thurgood was working for the NAACP already. So Harry Moore wrote him a letter and said, we want to move on this in Florida. And it was the first, I think, of many interactions that they had.
Being a teacher, particularly when he became principal of a school, he saw the inequities, not only in the school facilities, but also in the amount of money that the state was spending on black children versus white children. And of course, he was very much aware of the pay inequity for black and white teachers. So he had talked about this to a good friend of his, John Gilbert, who was a principal of the Cocoa Colored School, and convinced John to be the plaintiff in a lawsuit that he filed to equalize teacher pay.
During that time when we were all together, it was very, very sad so far as I'm concerned, because I can remember going to churches where Daddy would ask if he could speak and tell the people about the NAACP and perhaps start a chapter in that particular church. And the ministers always waited until the benediction was said. And people, some of them had gotten up and left before they would let him say anything. That still hurts, even now. So far, Daddy did teach black history because he taught all of us in fifth and sixth grade. But it was not a part of the curriculum. He did it on his own, and I'm sure that's another reason why they fired him. But yes, we do need, right now, we need some strong black leaders. That's the main thing. And of course, yes, teachers should realize what my dad went through to get their salaries equalized. And yes, they should be members of the NAACP, but I suppose they're still afraid as they were back in the 40s and 50s. That's the only answer that I can give you.
There were three big things that he worked on. One was teacher salaries, the other would be voter registration, and then the third would be lynchings. But really, this is another juncture where he and Thurgood Marshall came together. In 1941, Thurgood Marshall won the Supreme Court decision, Smith v. Allwright, that outlawed the white primary, which was the only election that mattered in the Deep South. Harry Moore immediately organized the Progressive Voters League in Florida and started registering black Floridians in the Democratic Party.
Harry Moore, of course, being an educated person, an educated man, knew that power lay in the ballot box. And one of the ways, if you cannot elect a person like yourself, then you try to use your voting power to vote for those persons who at least express some interest in your concerns. And so he and his good friend Ed Davis formed the Progressive Voters League, I believe in 1944, and they went about the state. That was a separate, of course, now at this time, Harry Moore had already established the Brevard County branch of the NAACP and had established other branches throughout the state. But the NAACP is nonpartisan. So they established this Progressive Voters League as a separate organization that strictly was devoted to registering black voters and getting them to vote. And they went about doing that over the next 7 years or so. The records say that they registered some 116,000 people.
This is one of the most surprising things I found when I started doing this book. I thought I was writing a book about an NAACP hero, and I found out that actually there was tremendous tension, conflict between Moore and the national office in New York. I think there were two things. One is his political activism. The NAACP was supposed to be nonpartisan, and Harry T. Moore understood that if you're not registered in the Democratic Party in Florida, it does no good. And so he started pushing to register and eventually registered over 100,000 blacks in the Democratic Party. At the same time, most of the black leadership in the NAACP were Republicans because that was the only party they could be part of, and they'd sort of get crumbs thrown their way. And so he got some resentment from black leaders in Florida, particularly in big cities, because he was a small town guy. But then more so, I think the national office didn't like it because he became a paid executive secretary, and all the money he was raising to pay his own salary could have gone to New York.
He established the Brevard County branch in 1934, and then he went on to establish branches throughout the states. And he concentrated mostly on the smaller towns and the rural areas because the larger towns already had branches. So he put his efforts into those smaller areas there. But as he got more and more involved in voter registration, of course, the national NAACP office wanted him to spend more time signing up NAACP members and establishing branches versus trying to register people to vote, because actually he was registering people to vote as Democrats, because at that time the Democratic Party ruled the state of Florida, and so he wanted to have voters in that party, and that created quite a bit of friction between Harry Moore and the national NAACP office, to the point that actually there was an effort put together to drive him out of office after he had formed what is now known as the Florida State Conference of NAACP branches. Harry Moore was the first president of that organization, which is in existence today.
Yeah, it was really one of the most tragic parts of this, and actually the thing more than anything that angered Evangeline Moore is when she found out, when my book came out, that they went out of their way they actually fired him before he was killed. And then as soon as he was killed, I described it as they became a cottage industry of raising money off Harry T. Moore, and had fundraisers all around the country and in New York and Madison Square Garden, raising money for the NAACP based on his murder.
His death was used as a galvanizing or rallying cry by the national office there, because the bomb that went off here in Mims, Florida, was heard around the world, and everybody knew about Harry T. Moore and his work here in Florida. So yes, there was events held that raised money and things that was done in his name after his death.
I had reservations on a train from Washington, D.C. to Titusville called the Silver Media. I was to leave, and I did leave on the day after Christmas at 7 o'clock in the morning. I did not know what had happened until I got off the train on the 27th and found a delegation of aunts, uncles, cousins, and what have you at the train station, but my parents were missing, and I knew at that point that there was something wrong. So I greeted all of my relatives, and finally my sister and I were riding in my Uncle George's car. That was my mother's brother, one of her brothers. We got into the car and sat down, and I just asked, I said, well, where is my mom and my dad? So nobody said a word for a few minutes. Then my Uncle George turned around and he said, Van, I guess I'm going to have to tell you the story. Your house was bombed Christmas night. Your father's dead and your mother's in the hospital. That's the way I found out.
The murders of Harry T. and Harriette V. Moore have never been solved. It's possible that it was Moore's activities registering African Americans to vote that led to a bomb being placed under his home. Others believe that it was his involvement in the infamous Groveland rape trial that inspired this act of domestic terrorism.
I tend to believe that really his activism in voter registration led ultimately to someone wanting him dead or taken out of commission there, because even today we know that voting power can change things. It can change the landscape. It can change society. It can change the people who make laws, enforce laws, and so I think that was that change of the status quo was a threat to many people there.
I think it was a political assassination. I don't think it was just some old racist Klansman said, let's take out that uppity so-and-so. I think it was because he had registered 100,000 black voters in the Democratic Party the night of his death at Christmas dinner at his mother-in-law's house in the Grove. One of the last conversations he had with his best friend from Cocoa was about how the black vote was going to determine the outcome of the 1952 governor's race. And he was going around the state saying the black vote will determine the outcome of every election in Florida. And I think that's why he was killed. I think he was killed to try to suppress black election power, and it worked. Black voter registration plummeted after his death. It took another 10 or 15 years till the civil rights movement to get it back to where it was. So I think it was a political assassination more than just a individual hate crime.
I consider his being able to get that 100,000 black folk registered to vote as probably the primary reason, because during that time, the state officials, of course, they were all white. They were very angry because Daddy preached the fact that if we have a voice in selecting people like congressmen and senators and other people who are working at the state capitol and in the counties as well, like the sheriff, that we would be able to approach them when things of this nature happened and demand that they do something about it. But before that time, we could only vote in the presidential election. And that was no good because the electoral votes, they control that anyway. So that is why he was determined that we needed to have a voice in government or we could not move forward.
In 1949, Harry T. Moore was actively involved in seeking justice for 4 young black men accused of raping a white woman in Groveland. One of the accused was killed by law enforcement before he could be arrested. The other 3 men were tortured during questioning and had evidence manufactured against them by the notoriously racist sheriff Willis McCall. The Supreme Court overturned the original convictions and a new trial was scheduled.
The day of a hearing for the new trial, Willis McCall and his deputy went to Rayford to pick him up. On the way back to Lake County, claimed that the 2 prisoners jumped him and attacked him, and he shot him. He emptied his revolver into him. He killed Sam Shepard, mortally, seriously, critically wounded Walter Irvin, who did survive, and told a completely different story, which is that McCall just yanked him out and started shooting. At that point, Harry T. Moore started calling for McCall to be removed from office, indicted for murder. He's telegramming and writing letters to the governor, to the U.S. attorney, to Thurgood Marshall, to the FBI. And then just 6 weeks later, he was blown up in his house. So the morning after the bombing in Mims, people immediately connected the Groveland case to the Moore bombing. And when the FBI agents and the local deputies worked their way through the crowd that had gathered and said, why would anyone have wanted to kill Harry Moore? Everybody immediately said Groveland.
Harry T. and Harriette V. Moore were killed 12 years before Medgar Evers, 14 years before Malcolm X, and 17 years before Martin Luther King Jr., but their legacy has often been overlooked.
In a way, I think they're like multiple tragedies. One is they were killed, and the murders have never been solved. And then, in some ways, it's almost equally tragic they were forgotten. I feel like the most poignant epitaph, really, is he was killed 3 years too early. If he had been killed in 1954, after the Brown decision, he would be Medgar Evers. He was Medgar Evers. He just did it before anybody was paying attention. He would have been in every history book. Everybody would have known his name. But it was 1951. There was no civil rights movement. There were no TV cameras filming the dogs attacking children in Birmingham. The murders were not solved. It was really just forgotten about.
In recent years, Harry T. and Harriette V. Moore have been getting some of the recognition they deserve. An exhibit about the Moores is on display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The Harry T. and Harriette V. Moore Cultural Complex, built on the Moore family homestead in Mims, Florida, has a civil rights museum and a reflecting pool. Evangeline Moore lived to see a replica of her family home constructed on the property, which was very gratifying for Bill Gary.
It was, Ben. It was actually a tear-jerking type event because once the house was completed and we had everything in here, we gave her a private tour before we had the ribbon cutting for it. And the thing that she said, which touched me so much, was that I'm finally home. Because prior to that, she had no home to go back to. As you mentioned, her home was bombed in 1951, was never rebuilt. She left and for many years never even came back to Florida.
Evangeline just buried this away for 40 years and repressed it. I mean, she told me that she and her sister Peaches never even talked about it. I mean, Peaches died in 1972, so 20 years go by. They never spoke of it. It was just too horrifying to look at. I think the attention that her parents got, therapy that she went through, that she said she had to really work through how much she had repressed all this, finally allowed her to really come out from that veil of sorrow and really repression of it. And I think it was the most fulfilling thing that happened in her life was those last 15 or 20 years of really seeing and being part of and really picking up the mantle of her father to spread the word about the causes that he fought for.
When a bomb exploded under the home of Harry T. and Harriette V. Moore on Christmas night 1951, the blast could be heard 3 miles away in Titusville. What resonates today is the memory of the important civil rights work accomplished by the Moores. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
and by the Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.